The basal ganglia, sometimes also called the basal nuclei, are a cluster of subcortical nuclei located at the base of the forebrain. The basal ganglia are anatomically very complex, as they're deeply interconnected with the neocortex, brainstem, and thalamus, among other brain areas. These extensive structural connections allow the basal ganglia to communicate with and influence the activity of a wide array of brain regions. Functionally, the basal ganglia are associated with voluntary movement. We know now that they're also involved in the learning and execution of actions that become habitual or automatic. More recently, scientists have recognized the basal ganglia also plays a key role in emotional and cognitive functions. In this course, we'll focus on the slightly better understood involvement of the basal ganglia in generating motor programs. We've already investigated how motor activity is carried out at a reflexive level in the spinal cord, with sensory neurons directly commanding the activity of lower motor neurons. But we also mentioned that higher motor neurons can add their own input to modulate lower motor neuron firing. These modulations are cognitively driven. They originate in the cerebral cortex and project down to the lower motor neurons via a pathway that runs through the main motor area, M1. This pathway continues through the brainstem to the spinal cord, and the basal ganglion contributes along the way. So you can see that the basal ganglion doesn't initiate voluntary motor movements, but rather it provides modulatory guidance, helping determine which particular movements are carried out, when, and how. Additionally, the basal ganglia is involved in procedural learning, in which people perfect a series of practice motor acts, like perfecting a tennis serve or learning to play the piano. Once you've learned them, these movements feel like they are done subconsciously, and in a way they are, or at least subcortically. The basal ganglia sends outputs to other brain regions through two distinct pathways, the direct and the indirect pathways. These pathways involve the basal ganglia sending signals to the cerebral cortex through thalamus. For now, you can think of the thalamus as a way station between sensory and subcortical structures and the higher cerebral cortex. The direct and indirect pathways appear to have opposite effects on the thalamus. Exciting the direct pathway has the net effect of exciting thalamic neurons, which in turn make direct excitatory connections onto motor neurons in the cerebral cortex. Exciting the indirect pathway, on the other hand, has the net effect of inhibiting thalamic neurons, preventing them from sending excitatory signals to the cerebral cortex. Thus, the direct pathway allows basal ganglia to increase motor activity, and the indirect pathway allows the basal ganglia to decrease it. How these two pathways work together is not yet understood. However, it appears that their interaction is necessary for the proper functioning of the basal ganglia. Indeed, a disrupted balance of excitation through the direct pathway and inhibition through the indirect pathway is thought to be the cause of the severe motor impairments known as extrapyramidal syndromes. These symptoms are thought to arise when one or the other pathway becomes abnormally influential over the other, tipping the basal ganglia's modulation towards too much excitation or too much inhibition. One hypothesis, for example, suggests that stimulation of the direct pathway excites motor or cognitive programs in the cortex that are adaptive for the task at hand, while the indirect pathway at the same time suppresses the execution of competing motor or cognitive programs. A number of neurological disorders are the result of damage to the basal ganglia, including Parkinson's and Huntington's disease. Parkinson's disease, or PD, is characterized by rigidity and slowness of movement. Patients also show a distinctive resting tremor or rhythmic shaking of the hands and fingers. Rigidity and slowness appear to come from difficulty in initiating and carrying out voluntary movements. In more severe cases, patients experience periods when they're unable to initiate movement at all. At the same time, patients often also experience involuntary, undesired movement in the form of the resting tremor. The cause of PD has been attributed to the loss of dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra, an area of the basal ganglia where neurons release dopamine to simultaneously excite the direct pathway and inhibit the indirect pathway. Decreased dopamine release from the substantia nigra thus tips the balance towards the inhibitory indirect pathway, keeping the thalamic neurons overly inhibited. As a result, motor cortical neurons that receive input from thalamic neurons are less excitable, and the motor system doesn't respond appropriately to the voluntary drive to move. Huntington's disease, or HD, is in many ways the opposite of Parkinson's disease, at least as far as the symptoms are concerned. While patients with Parkinson's disease experience rigidity and abnormally slowed movements as their main symptom, HD patients are primarily characterized by abnormal involuntary movements that are often abrupt, irregular, and unpredictable. These are called choreiform movements of the body, named after the Greek word choreia, meaning dance. They especially affect the extremities and the face. Choreiform movements may look like adaptive movements, but they occur involuntarily and in inappropriate situations. In this way, they interfere with the individual's dexterity and balance. For example, choreia in oral muscles can also occur, resulting in an impaired speech and swallowing ability. Huntington's disease is thought to result from the selective loss of neurons in a specific area of the basal ganglia, called the striatum, which delivers input through both the direct and indirect pathways. However, only striatal neurons lost in Huntington's disease are those involved in driving activity of the indirect pathway in the basal ganglia. Those involved in the direct pathway appear not to be affected. In opposition to Parkinson's disease, the balance of excitation and inhibition is tipped in favor of the excitatory neurons in the direct pathway. In the absence of normal inhibitory influence of the indirect pathway on thalamic neurons and their cortical targets, thalamic neurons may fire inappropriately and randomly, thus causing the motor cortex to execute motor programs that are involuntary.